So tonight, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. A simile, by the way, that is attributed to both Dostoevsky and Mark Twain. Now, you would be forgiven for asking, yes, Rabbi, but what elephant in the room? Not that there isn't an elephant, but in fact, there are so many elephants. What elephant, Rabbi, are you planning on talking about? And just to prove the point, and because for the first time in a long time I am speaking to you as actual human beings and not to my monitor, I'm actually going to ask you to answer that question without singing it back to me. But if I were to take a survey, and I'm about to right now, what elephant in the room do you think the rabbi is going to speak about tonight? What are the elephants that are on your mind? This is the participatory part of the service. Just call it out. What is the troubling issue that needs to be discussed tonight? Well, anti-Semitism, First Nations, COVID, Palestine, the new cancer. Not a troubling issue, but maybe for that family over there. Right. Anything else? Those are the only elephants? Sorry? Residential school survivors and the horrible discovery that we continue to have of the unmarked graves of children. And we could go on and on. And I want to thank you, by the way, for giving me a list of topics for my high holiday sermons. I appreciate that. It's a little bit of a focus group. By the way, speaking of elephants, I learned while watching that herd of elephants that was roaming through southwestern China on this year-long journey to nowhere. And if you saw this, they're wreaking havoc and capturing hearts and confounding scientists along the way. That the elephants, they left their home on a wildlife reserve in the southwestern Yunnan province more than a year ago and have since traveled roughly 500 kilometers. The creatures have been seen trotting down urban streets, raiding farms for food and water, visiting a car dealership. Did you see that one on video? That was pretty cool. And even showing up at a retirement home where they poked their trunks into some of the rooms, prompting one elderly man to hide under his bed. I was only surprised there was only one that hid under their bed. They were most recently seen on the outskirts of Kunming, a city of 7 million people. Scientists don't yet know what sparked their unconventional journey, but many have speculated that they're trying to find a new home because their traditional habitat has become uninhabitable, largely because of global warming. And while a group of elephants is most commonly called a herd, the preferred term for a group of elephants is a parade of elephants. Do you know that? A parade of elephants. And who doesn't love a parade? Well, I'll tell you who doesn't love a parade. Apparently, anyone who has to see an Israeli flag, or with a Jewish star, or a falafel truck serving Israeli food in a major North American city this past week. See what I did there? Parade and parade. Earlier this week, you may have heard, and this means heard with your ears and not the kind of traveling elephants, that the Chicago Dyke March, an annual LGBTQ pride parade that goes as far back as 2017, ejected marchers for carrying flags with Jewish symbols, did it again this week. This year, they promoted their upcoming event with an image showing the burning of an Israeli and American flags. The Instagram promotional post was removed by that social media company for hate speech or hate symbols, in a warning that threatened to delete the group's account if they continued to do this. The Dyke March responded by urging its followers to make a screen capture, take a picture of the post, and to share it to prevent attempts by Zionists and Instagram to censor our account. By the way, they use the word Zionist in the singular, and I think there are more than one of us that consider ourselves Zionists and would object to the Jew hatred and consider it hate speech. The march's stated goals are to abolish the Chicago Police Department, the Israeli occupying forces, and the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. The event's description does not list anything about LGBTQ-specific efforts. An unrelated but not entirely dissimilar news story reported that a Philadelphia food truck festival called Eat the Borders was canceled when groups objected to the inclusion of an Israeli food truck called Moshava and threatened protests and even violence if the truck was not removed from the food truck fair. At first, the organizers agreed. They agreed with the anti-Semites and the Jew haters, and they disinvited Mosheva, the food truck. And then when that sparked outrage amongst those who felt that Jews were being targeted for hate, the organizers decided to cancel the event entirely. The event organizer then issued the following statement. Our mistake this time with not only our event partners, but in general, was not educating ourselves and not properly making sure that everyone is properly represented. So that's where we made the decision to cancel the event. Now, I'm not entirely sure what they mean by our mistake this time, or what not being educated has to do with their decision. Does that mean that they never should have included the Israeli cuisine food truck to begin with? Or, as one report had it, that because the Palestinian food truck refused to appear if the Israeli food truck was present, that they should have disinvited the Israeli food truck pro forma from the beginning. By the way, in Israel, Israeli and Palestinian restaurants, not to mention their food, exists on the same street, often the same dinner table, and even the same plate. But apparently not in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. What I do know is that what they didn't say was, geez, we're really sorry for letting our event be pushed around by a bunch of Jew haters, for letting hummus be equated with Hamas. And we apologize to Mosheva and the Jewish community for being complicit yet again in allowing Jew hatred to be normalized. They didn't say that. Instead, the Jewish food truck was scapegoated and made the reason that all the other food trucks had no festival to participate in and no income that weekend. Now, I'm not going to solve the millennial-old scourge of anti-Semitism here tonight. I will keep trying, and maybe not ever. But I do want to say one thing on the anti-Semitism that seems to be flourishing on the activist left, and I've talked about it on the radical right, particularly when it comes to the intersectionality of multiple social justice issues. Intersectionality can really draw its raison d'etre, see I used French there, from an oft-quoted but often misunderstood and sloppily applied statement by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who famously wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And then he continued, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." If you leave out the second part of the quote, then it sure seems that the ends justify the means. But the quote actually means that the means have to justify the ends. It's from this noble principle that well-meaning but clearly ignorant and misinformed activists have oversimplified both the incredibly complex reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the complexity of race relations in North America. Now, I could say just in the United States, but we know that, of course, those issues are absolutely here in Canada as well. As Yehuda Kurtzer, the North American director of the Shalom Hartman Institute that runs the I Engage program that we've done here for so many years, as he explained this week when addressing this issue on a podcast about this issue, he said, racial justice is an easy story for people to connect with as a means of mapping it onto a hard story. Racial justice is an easy story for people to connect with as a means of mapping it onto a hard story. In fact, there is nothing that compares to the horror of the racial situation in the United States, nothing to compare that to the rather complex, nuanced, frustrating, and emotionally exhausting situation of Israel-Palestine. But people look for similarity. We are constantly categorizing by asking ourselves, how is what I see like what I know? How is this like that? The social justice movement on the activist left sees a power imbalance. They see organized police against street protesters. They see, or they think they see, white Israelis against brown Palestinians. And they say that this is like that. But it's not the same. In fact, if you allow for complexity, what you see in Israel today is perhaps the end game of what the Black Lives Matter movement is actually striving for. The Jews were a stateless people, subjugated, oppressed, and powerless for about 70 years. Through political power, for more than 70 years, but until about 70 years ago. Through political power, tragedy, short-lived international empathy or guilt, and ultimately, like the formation of most nation states, through military force, the Jewish people, nearly annihilated, subjected to the most systematic genocide in modern history, returned to their historic homeland. They claimed for the first time in 2,000 years, and were granted by a democratic vote of 2/3 of the United Nations, of all the nations of the world at the time, a right to self-determination and autonomy, and they built a state and a civilization informed by their collective trauma and experience. Jews are no longer under the boot of racist police forces and Nazi stormtroopers and pogroms and Cossacks, but now tasked with administering to themselves and others the very justice that we were so long denied. That's an aspirational story. That's not far removed from the desires of equality and equity and justice and even reparations of the Black Lives Matter movement that it seeks. And it's not that simple. One is not a mirror image of the other. They don't fit each other's narratives perfectly. But the cause of Zionism and a Jewish and democratic state is far closer to the cause and values of progressivism than the non-democratic, non-inclusive, anti-LGBTQ, theocratic movements and countries that these intersectionally aligned groups have attached themselves to. They say that politics makes strange bedfellows, but this is an unholy union. It boggles my mind. It boggles my mind that Jews who have been both on the receiving end of so much of the world's hatred, violence, and bigotry, as well as on the front lines, standing shoulder to shoulder and arm in arm with social justice movements since the days of the biblical prophets, are seen as colonialists, white supremacists, and compared to Nazis. To put it frankly to all of the movements who I'm sure are not listening to this, but to put it frankly to them, all the movements that want a more just, equitable, and inclusive and diverse society, Israel should be your ambition, not your abomination. And yes, Israel is still becoming. And yes, Israel is not fully just. And yes, Israel is at times, sometimes too many times, racist and extremist and abusive and undemocratic. And yes, so is the United States. And yes, so is Canada. And yes, so is. But the proper response to those deficiencies in Western democracies is to make them better, not make them disappear. Vote the tyrants out of office because you can vote them out of office in a democracy, and replace them with people who represent your voice and your values. To a moderate degree, Israel did just that. Just these past weeks, it may take many more elections, and Israel can do many of those in just a year, to get where it needs to, but that is how a country will change. Not through violence, not through calls for its destruction from the river to the sea, but through the ballot box. But the problem is not just over there, be that over the border or across the sea. It's right here in Vancouver as well. It's coming to UBC. This week, UBC announced that climate activist and journalist Naomi Klein and her husband Avi Lewis are joining the faculty at the Department of Geography at UBC. Klein and Lewis are a powerful couple in the anti-Israel pro-BDS movement. Local anti-Israeli activists will have new allies in their quest to delegitimize Israel and to further move these two peoples who are bound to be together further and further apart rather than bringing them close together. And here is the thing, and it's my final point for now on this issue. None of this yelling and none of this screaming at each other is going to solve anything. Not the Dyke March, not the food truck ban, not the Ferguson to the Palestine linkage and chants. It's not going to solve the complex problem and relationship between Israelis and Palestinians and the land that they both must ultimately share and live together upon. Any group on either side calling for the eradication or annihilation, actual or metaphorical, of the other should be rejected from the start. Famously, there is the story told of King Solomon, who was confronted with an impossible dilemma of trying to determine the birth mother of a child, a baby boy. Now, both women, as we know from the story, claimed the child was theirs, and Solomon questioned them. And ultimately, he said the only solution was to cut the baby in half. One of the women accepted that horrible and unimaginable solution. The other, the true birth mother, said, "No! If the choice is me having my child or the death of my child, of that child, give the baby to the other woman so that he may live." No group on either side that wants to see the land cleared of either people truly loves the land, truly wants peace, or can even be considered right or just. Left and right will not solve this problem. We must meet in the middle, and it is nowhere that simple. Shabbat Shalom.